it's a bit different this one. This is our and normally Fiona Fanning is on from Spaces. We've been doing this quite historically, and normally we're on my second pint of ale, third pint of ale probably after a Christmas dinner at the counting house. But this year is a bit different for obvious reasons, and so but we still do the combined presentation, and Hal has done this for the last few years for us because we've got something legislative, and I'll let him talk about that shortly. Now, just for everybody's benefit, you know, we've got CIBSE people on here and Spaces people on here. So some people will know CIBSE, some will know Spaces, and Spaces is an organisation around local authorities. I'll let Fiona do a quick introduction if that's all right. And for those in Spaces, if you probably already know about CIBSE, but if you need any more information on that, come to myself. Okay, Fiona, do you want to just say a quick intro from Spaces?
Yeah, Spaces is the Society for Public Architecture, Construction, Engineering and Surveying, and we're open to all those in the construction industry that are working on or with public sector or for public sector buildings.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. So I've been joint member of both actually, and the collaboration is so close because the aims and objectives are very much the same. So without further ado, though, I'll just dive into the actual presentation and introduce Hal. Most people know Hal, Technical Director, Dr Hywel Davies, Technical Director for CIBSE, and what I consider the horse's mouth when it comes to all legislative requirements. So I'm going to hand over to Hal, who's going to give us a bit of an introduction and talk about the latest development with the Building Safety Bill.
So what I'm going to talk about is latest developments with the Building Safety Bill. I mean, two very serious comments to make at the beginning. And the first one is a very somber one, which is that the reason that I'm here talking and the reason that we're all paying attention to this is, of course, what happened at Grenfell Tower 3.5 years ago. And so, you know, I just want us to stop for a minute and remember that that's why we're here, and that what government is now having to do is to act because of the consequences. And it's also, I hope, a reminder to us all that this is an incredibly serious issue, and all of us as construction professionals have got a responsibility to deal with this in the best way that we can. So, you know, many of you will know me, and you know that I don't like to give a boring monologue. And I think there is a place for humour in presentations, but perhaps it's slightly more subdued on an occasion like this because of the circumstances that we're dealing with. The second serious comment is that although I do have close connections with MHCLG, they are the ones who are responsible for the legislation, and they really are the fount of all knowledge. I will do my best to provide accurate and impartial commentary on where I understand that we are, but by way of an apology, I may not get it 100% right. I will do my level best to, but I may not. And I do need to be clear, this is a moving target, and I'll explain some of the reasons for that as we work through the presentation. So if I can get that, there we are. I think we do need to be clear that this is a unique moment, not because of a global pandemic. It's a unique moment in the construction sector in terms of legislation. It's the biggest upheaval in the sector in at least our working lives, and probably in 2 or 3 generations. The last primary legislation for our sector was the Building Act in 1984. And here we are 36 years on with major reform. And in that period, and in fact, I'd go back to the early 1960s when there was a major report on the sector called the Banwell Report. And then 30 years on, there was the Latham Review. And then Sir John Egan produced a couple of reports. And then Paul Morell, by his own admission, revisited all of the things that had been in those reports and had been ignored. And there have been one or two others since. And every time, if I'm really blunt, I think the industry has put its head down and thought, if we brazen it out for 3 or 4 years, there'll be no political appetite to force this through and we can go back to business as usual. I want to be really clear, and I'm going to nail my colours absolutely to the mast. And if anybody doesn't like this, I apologise, but you won't change my view. This industry has got to be prepared to change this time, and I do not believe there is any political appetite whatsoever not to force it through. There's a double negative in there, but I think you'll get my drift. The government is absolutely committed to doing everything it can to support a radical change in the construction sector. And, you know, if you don't want to hear it just from me, I hope you will hear it, or you will be picking it up from Dame Judith Hackett whenever she speaks, and from other industry leaders. There is a real commitment. And I would say, how can there be anything else? You know, here we are in 2020 in what I think we would all call a moderately civilized society, and we've had the Grenfell Tower fire. How can we possibly entertain the concept of that ever happening again in this country? And I don't just mean in England, I mean in the whole of the United Kingdom. You know, we have to change. It has to be different. And that's what the draft Building Safety Bill and the new Building Safety Regulator are all around. And I want to be very clear on something about the Building Safety Regulator, because I hear misunderstanding on this often. The new regulator is going to be responsible for regulating all aspects of building. It is not just a new regulator for a small group of higher risk buildings, mostly or almost all residential. This is a new regulatory regime for the whole of building. In addition, that regulator will take on direct responsibility for the building control function on a smaller group of higher risk buildings. And I'll come on to that in a bit more detail later. But this is about change for the whole sector, for everything we build. And I hope that nobody is left in any doubt about that. And also at the beginning, although I'm not going to say much about it because I don't think time will permit, we're not dealing with this issue on its own. So we've got the Climate Change Act, the commitment to zero carbon by 2050, and that is driving changes to building related energy legislation, be it Part L, be it energy performance of buildings related, or even one or two other things around energy regulation in existing buildings that may come through. They're all in addition to sorting out the building safety issues. And then on top of those, we've also got the move to digitalise in the sector, and we're also looking at greater use of modularisation and factory manufacture and off-site assembly, which are all a really important part of the overall reform package. So I hope you can see why I think it is a time of really significant and radical change in our sector. And in many ways, that ought to be exciting, even with the backdrop against which it is having to be undertaken. So I want to work through in the next sort of 35 minutes, and I'll try and leave a good time for questions. How did we get here? What's currently happening, and where is it all leading? So how we got here? Well, you know, sadly, the 14th of June 2017 says it all. And that led to Dame Judith Hackett's independent review of building regulations and fire safety, and her final report was issued in the summer of 2018. And I just want to remind us briefly that Dame Judith was commissioned to focus on high-rise residential buildings, that was the term at the time, to make recommendations that will ensure we have a sufficiently robust regulatory system for the future. I don't often like the word ensure because it's a very high bar to pass. But actually, I think in this case, it's probably appropriate. And Dame Judith was also given a task to provide further assurance to residents that the complete system is working and that the buildings that they live in are safe and remain safe. And it's really important that we remember this is not about building inanimate objects. This is about building buildings in which people live. This is ultimately about people. And Dame Judith was asked to map the current regulatory system and to look at competencies, professional and other duties, the balance of responsibilities within the system, and particularly at how fire safety standards are handled. She was asked to look at the theoretical coherence of the regulatory system and to look overseas to see how it compares, and then to make recommendations. And to quote Dame Judith's words, and she produced an interim report in December 2017 before the final report. And in December 2017, she described how the regulatory system was not fit for purpose. In the intervening period between the interim and the final report, we have seen further evidence confirming the deep flaws in the current system. And she went on to elaborate a lack of an audit trail over essential safety work. And I, having seen some of the names on the call, I'm mindful that many of you will be aware of the Ledbury estate, a large panel system estate that was a contemporary project to Ronan Point, and it was meant to be structurally strengthened in the wake of the inquiry into the Ronan Point gas explosion in 1968. It emerged in the course of the Hackett review that repair work had never actually been carried out. The whole issue around fire doors and how they really behave and what the test data says. And since Grenfell, there have been further fires in tower blocks, on balconies, and other buildings. There was a 4-storey block destroyed at Worcester Park not that long ago. And I suspect many of you will remember that there was a major fire in a car park in Liverpool, which came perilously close to spreading to a block of flats nearby and wiped out hundreds of cars as well. So we've had quite a bit going on, and Dame Judith's word was that the current system is broken. A lot of people argued at the time. I'm not seeing many people arguing now, and I think the more we see coming out of the Grenfell Tower inquiry at Paddington, the less ground anybody has got to argue with her. She identified a number of areas that underpinned this system failure. So ignorance, people not knowing the difference between regulations and guidance, and not really understanding the guidance properly. So just to illustrate my point, on the left of the screen, you can see the Building Regulations 2010. The clue is in the name, they're regulations. And then on the right, I've put up Part L2A. There are about 23 approved documents. And that is guidance on how to comply with Part L of Schedule 1 to the regulations. And I have to say, the number of people who think that the one on the right tells them what they have to do and not gives them guidance on how they can comply with the requirements on the left, it is staggering. Dame Judith picked up on this, and it is an ongoing work stream in government. And I would say watch this space on this one in particular, but not just this one. Another key issue, indifference. And Dame Judith picked out the tendency for people to win a job for a price, and then they would want to get it done as quickly and cheaply as possible, because the quicker they do it, the sooner they can move on to the next job, and the cheaper they do it, the more profit they can make. And I'm sure that we've all seen some of the horror stories around problems in homes over the last few years, which these are people's homes. They're probably the biggest investment people make if they own them. And if they don't own them, it's still where they live and where they want to be able to go home at night and feel safe. And the whole issue of residents' concerns, which Dame Judith found were widely ignored. In my own experience of advising people, if they're not ignored, they're dealing with management agents who just bluntly don't understand what they're actually supposed to be doing. And some of those undertaking building work don't prioritise safety, and the confusion between regulations and guidance gives them all sorts of ambiguities. And it was Dame Judith who said gaming the system. Another area of failure is around a lack of clarity on roles and responsibilities. Who is responsible for what? And there's a degree of fragmentation within the industry. And I think we would all recognise that caricature, which Paul Morell first produced, that we've got professions or segments of the supply chain sitting in glorious silos, but actually it's not very clever. And it certainly doesn't produce systematic outcomes. We have inadequate regulatory oversight and enforcement tools. Enforcement activity isn't related to the size or complexity of a project. And I'm afraid in the last few years, I think we're all aware that those responsible for building control have had too much to do and not enough time to do it at the very least. And that's had all sorts of problems. And it's not just in relation to fire safety. Many of us within CIBSE know that enforcement of aspects of the energy part of the regulations has been questionable for, I'm afraid, the best part of 20 years. And I think we've all seen with some of the challenges over the last few months and the requirements for building ventilation, that perhaps we haven't always got it quite right with ventilation either. So there are some enforcement problems for us to deal with. And it emerged during Dame Judith's work that the balance of the cost to the enforcing body against the potential penalties for those who were alleged to have breached the regulations is completely out of kilter and discouraged enforcement bodies from taking enforcement action. So, you know, that's an area that is going to need to be addressed. And I would say that the Building Safety Bill is very clear about that. So key findings and recommendations. Dame Judith recommended the creation of a regulatory body. Her initial model was around building control, fire and rescue, and the health and safety executive. And as things have moved on in the last 2.5 years, we now have the building safety regulator being proposed, which will sit within the HSE and will take responsibility as I outlined at the beginning. She advocates a reform of the system of building control to limit the effective choice of regulator and to remove, as far as possible, cost-based competition between inspectors. So the idea that we can go to the cheapest building inspector is going to be challenged. And as I say, for the higher risk buildings that are in scope for the new stricter regime, the regulator will handle the building control function. there will be no choice, and they will manage that. And it's also important to stress that that role will not end at the completion certificate, or at practical completion, or at handover. The building safety regulator will take responsibility for higher risk buildings, which broadly, I believe the current definition, and this is still subject to being finalised, but I believe the current definition is residential buildings with more than one residential unit over 18 metres in height. There may be one or two other wrinkles around that, but you get the general drift. And there are between 11 and 12,000 of them in England. And the new regime will apply to all of them. Yes, even the ones that have been built, they will have to be managed effectively, and there will be a safety case regime brought in, and they will have to demonstrate that they have an ongoing system to manage the safety of those buildings and the safety of the people who live in them. So, a significant new regulatory approach. And then, in addition, for buildings, for new residential buildings, there will be a system of approval gateways, and that will cover planning, it will cover detailed plans and at handover. And there will be a much greater emphasis that what is approved at the detailed plan stage is what is expected to be built. And there will have to be a robust change management system, so that when somebody comes along and says, oh, well, the plan that was approved said we were going to use such and such. We could get something for half the price and use that. Well, then you will need to demonstrate that whatever it was that you were going to get that's half the price actually satisfies all of the requirements. And that there is a proper change management plan and a proper evaluation of product substitutions or changes to design. And then at handover, there will be a need to demonstrate that the building is safe to occupy, not just that it ticks all the necessary boxes in the approved documents. And then Dame Judith proposed the concept of a golden thread of information to be created during design and construction and handed over at completion. And again, the golden thread is an evolving topic, but the idea is that the key information to enable people to manage a building safely is pulled together from the outset, that the things that they're going to need are put aside as those pieces of information are developed, so that, for example, a housing association that manages a block of flats has got all the information it needs to manage it properly. And that we try to get away from this, the culture in which the building's designed and then the contract is let and the contractor comes along and they don't trust the designer, so they redesign it and produce another set of information. And then when they've finished the building, that all gets put in a pile of box files, and whoever is taking on the building has to try and work it out from scratch. Now, they shouldn't be doing that, because there are things like Regulation 38, which requires the handover of fire safety information. And there are one or two other regulations around commissioning and information about the building services systems and the building logbook that are all meant to happen, but I'm afraid far too often don't. And that's all going to be reinforced by the new regime. And there is going to be an expectation that the information that people need to manage the building is handed over. And then Dame Judith recommended that there needs to be clearer and more effective product specification and testing, and that the scope and the application of products and systems and the resulting implications must be more clearly communicated in plain, non-technical language. If anybody's been paying attention to the hearings at the Grenfell Tower inquiry over the last 3 or 4 weeks in Module 2, and has heard the evidence being given by a number of witnesses, then you will see why this is absolutely necessary. We have got to have clarity over what products are, what they have been tested for, what the results of those tests were, and what that product is considered suitable to be used for, and therefore, by definition, what it is not suitable to be used for. And again, in this area, Dame Judith had a number of very explicit recommendations about the testing regime. And what I've just said, that it's got to be clear what products can be used for and what the test data actually supports. And also, and this is aimed very much at those who maintain the standards, so those of us who are involved in British standards need to pay attention to this, that our test methods and standards need to be maintained under a periodic review process. And these are all things that we will need to pay attention to. So that's all Dame Judith's review of what happened. What's happening now? Well, the government has accepted all of Dame Judith's findings, and that's quite clear, and that's what they're committed to deliver. And the key thing is it demands a radical change of culture. Now, it's quite clear that we can change the culture without anybody passing any legislation. In fact, legislation and culture change probably don't fit very well together. You can pass all the legislation in the world, it won't change the culture. So the challenge, I think, for us, particularly as professionals, and I think that's probably everybody on this call would put themselves in that category, away and give a very hard think to how we change the culture. Now, there will be some things it will be difficult to change unilaterally, but we've really got to be prepared to look at what's being asked and ask, what can we start to do now before the legislation comes through, before other changes are made, and how can we help to contribute to a changing culture across the industry. And that's a responsibility for all of the professional bodies, not just CIBSE, and it's a responsibility for all, I would say, responsible businesses in the sector. And I think it's a responsibility for one other group, it's a responsibility for clients, and particularly, dare I say, for public clients. We do need to start seeing the public sector really setting an example and seeking not to take outrageously low bids that cannot possibly be delivered at the price, and instead be looking for bids that are going to deliver reasonable outcomes, of which the most important is a safe outcome. So I think there's a challenge here for every single one of us. And the government, as I've already made clear, I hope, is establishing the new building safety regulator. The fire safety bill has not only been announced, it's gone through both houses of Parliament and is now back with the House of Commons to consider some amendments made by the House of Lords, and that I don't think will take very long. So I think we can anticipate the new Fire Safety Act being in place early in the new year. And that in particular tightens up the rules about fire risk assessments in residential buildings, which has been a significant bone of contention. And that's going to be an important outcome. And it's going to be the first significant legislative change beyond the change to Regulation 7 that government can point to that has come through from the tragedy. The new building safety bill is in development. It was published in July and went to the Select Committee on Housing, Communities and Local Government in the summer, and they have been scrutinising it. And a couple of weeks ago, they produced their report, which I think it's important to start by saying, in principle and overall, they welcome the bill. They do have a number of detailed comments, but in principle, they welcome the bill. And my understanding is that civil servants are now very busy reviewing the recommendations from the Select Committee and preparing them preparing them for introduction to Parliament in the early part of next year. If I'm a little vague about timescales, it's because I suspect that nobody knows the exact timescales, but I think it's fair to say that this is being driven with a degree of urgency. And then there's going to be a new regime for construction product safety and approvals. This was announced a little while ago. It's a complete schedule in the draft bill, and we're awaiting for announcements. And I think, in fairness to officials, I wouldn't be surprised if they're pausing, looking at some of what's coming out of the Grenfell inquiry and double checking their plans on some of this. And of course, we've also got the issue that I think it's 24 days until we know that the transition period post-EU will end. I'm not sure that anybody's quite certain what's going to begin on the 1st of January, but it will have implications for construction product marking and for testing, and we're all going to have to pay close attention to that, because at the moment there's some significant uncertainty over that, I would say. And then a really important one for all of us, a new competence framework for all in the industry. And again, this isn't just for people working on the higher risk buildings. It will focus on them, but it will also apply to the industry as a whole. And frankly, it's not going to be tenable to have a bunch of people who've got clearly defined competencies to work on buildings in scope, but then when they're working on something else, they don't need to think about the competence. It's got to be more holistic than that. Government produced an implementation plan in December 2018, and again, committed to the new system, committed to bring forward legislation, which, as we can see, they have done, and made it very clear, even 2 years ago, that we're going to have a far-reaching overhaul of the whole system. Again, to keep the story reasonably complete, in December 2018, the changes to Regulation 7 that prohibit the use of combustible materials in external walls or on specified attachments to buildings over 18 metres came in. There are some exceptions, which are largely where there isn't a non-combustible option and for components or elements that are not going to create a significant fire risk. And more recently, the Society of Facade Engineering, which is a division of CIBSE, worked with the Centre for Window and Cladding Technology based in Bath to develop some guidance, some detailed guidance on how to comply with the regulation. And of course, in complying with Regulation 7, you've also got to comply with Regulation Requirement B4 of the building regulations, which is the requirement to design external walls to adequately resist the external spread of fire. In July 2019, we had clarifications to approved document B and further guidance on complying with the requirements in Part B. We had a consultation on the reforms to building safety, which closed just before the summer break and has informed much of what is coming through that I've already described. And the bill and all that's going with it is there to provide greater definition and clarity over competence. We've talked about the regulatory arrangements. Also looking at how we provide greater clarity over regulations and standards and guidance. And above all, how do we put residents at the heart of building safety? This is about their homes. It may be about the homes of some of the people who are listening now, but this is about people. It's not just about buildings. And again, to re-emphasize the point about driving culture change, and actually creating a more responsible building industry. We've had further major announcements in 2020 with the announcement of the new building safety regulator and the new regime, the fire safety bill, which is nearly through Parliament, further updated advice on building safety in existing buildings, the consolidated advice note that came out earlier this year. We're familiar with the building safety bill, and even relatively recently further announcements about funding for buildings with aluminium composite material cladding on them. So there's a huge amount going on. I want to draw things to a close and move to questions by just asking what are the implications for us as professional engineers. Well, the first thing is, and you don't have to insert CIBSE here. There are other professional bodies that we work with. You could be a fire engineer, you could be a mechanical engineer, you could be a structural engineer. But being M something and being a chartered professional, be that engineer, surveyor, or something else, is not going to be enough. We have to move from a system of showing competence once for life to a system in which people demonstrate ongoing competence and are prepared to have that competence re-evaluated and revalidated from time to time. So as an institution, CIBSE will need to consider how our current membership and registration is going to support that system. And that will be a change. It'll be a change for the institution managing it. It'll be a change for the professionals who are part of it. And we're going to need to work out how we respond to the gateways, the concept of building safety certificates and requirements for sign-off. How are we as an institution going to continue to provide tools and knowledge and guidance to our membership and to the wider industry and even beyond the industry to support these changes? We've already been asked to provide input to a new British standard on digital management of fire safety information. One of my colleagues is working closely on that at the moment. I'm going to pause here because I'm conscious that we've got 20 minutes left, and I think it would be good to allow for some questions. So I'm going to stop and turn to James to lead on the question session.
Okay, I'll start on that. We've not got loads coming just yet, but I do have an echo. Everyone just check they're on mute for me, please. It's great. Mute. Okay,
You're
so
not on mute, James.
No, I'm not, but I'm just seeing if anyone else is. Let's just make sure it helps the echo. So, look, Hal, thank you very much for that. Really insightful, and as always, there's lots to talk about. I did try and prompt a couple of questions. We've got a few so far, and that last one you were just talking about the qualifications and the competence. So the new role of building safety regulator. How do we make sure that it carries significant responsibility? So how do we make sure that's got the right credentials and qualifications applied to that?
Now, can I just clarify, is that a question about the regulator themselves?
Well, yes, so the regulator's there, but I don't know, Sean's asked a question. If Sean wants to elaborate.
I'll have to unmute him if he wants to talk.
Okay, so the question is, do you know if the new role of the building safety regulator has been tested with insurance providers? The role carries significant responsibility, and we would hope it doesn't fail in the same way the EW1S forms.
Right. Okay, I'm going to have a go at this, James. So the new regulator is going to sit within HSE. So I am very tempted to say, well, I don't think anybody questions the capability of the HSE. They may not always agree with its views, they may not always agree with its decisions, but you cannot argue that over the nearly 50 years since the HSE was established, workplace health and safety has improved dramatically. And the building safety regulator is being established within the HSE because they have the framework and the capacity, and as I say, nearly 50 years of experience in regulating workplace safety, and they will be applying that into regulating buildings. And they will be supported that the building safety bill runs to, I think it's 120 clauses. It's a significant piece of legislation, and it's going to give the new regulator both the powers and responsibilities to tackle this. And I'm well aware that there's already a significant team involving both MHCLG people, at high levels, and very senior people in the HSE, and it's being overseen by a transition board chaired by Dame Judith herself. There's a huge amount of work going into getting this set up so that it works effectively. Yes, they will need to have conversations with people like UK Finance and the insurers, but this is a whole order of magnitude of activity above EWS1. And I do think I'd like to be clear, the EWS1 forms were created by the RICS to support valuers in making financial decisions about buildings. EWS1 is not about life safety decisions, and it's not about regulating the life safety of buildings. So whilst I don't want to disagree that there are significant issues with EWS1, please let's not confuse it with the role of the new regulator.
Okay, thank you very much.
I hope that's some help.
Well, yeah, okay. So there's a few more questions here. We'll run through some of them. There's a bit of a controversial one. It might be, I don't know how we could ask this one. My question is, did the CDM regs have any good effects? It's a bit cynical, but it's my personal opinion.
Okay, I've got a suspicion I know who asked that question, and I'll be following this up with you later, sir, if it's the person I think it is. And well, I'm going to give a simple answer. I think the answer is yes. CDM has. Now, yes, there were some problems that came along with CDM, but the data suggests that the CDM regs have been effective, as indeed those in mid-career or later may recall that back 20 odd years ago, the Deputy Prime Minister was a certain John Prescott. He was a bit of a character. One of the things he did was to get the industry leaders in a room fairly early in the Labour administration under Tony Blair, and show them the safety statistics of the construction sector. And he challenged them to do something about it. And he said, we'll come back in a year and have a look and see what you're doing. And if you're not doing enough, then we'll step in and we'll start regulating more vigorously and enforcing more rigorously. And I think it's fair to say that in the last 20 years, the statistics bear out that the safety culture in the industry has changed dramatically. Yeah. And I take two things from that. One is that those efforts which fed through into CDM as well have been effective. And if it could be done for construction site safety, why can't we have culture change more broadly in the industry? Yeah, I think if anybody wants to say it can't be done, there's the thing to go back to and ask, it could be done there, why can't it be done again?
Okay, good one, thank you. Another question is, the requirement that non-combustible materials are used on or in the exterior facade, how does this affect the selection of ventilation components of the building structure?
Well, unless somebody wants to tell me that there's a fundamental challenge in ventilating a building without using combustible materials, I'm not sure that I can see what the problem is. I know there are some concerns that, for example, there may be limited availability of flues, but I don't think that it's impossible to ventilate a building properly without using combustible materials. So I'm not entirely sure whether there's a huge problem there. And if I've misunderstood the question, my apologies, and somebody can come back to me afterwards.
Okay, it's another question. So, is the intention that the golden thread of information with details such as a fire strategy would be created by the principal designer alongside the pre-construction information and then transferred to the principal contractor before client handover?
That's a really good question, and my simple answer to it is yes. Yes, and because it doesn't stop with the principal contractor. The principal contractor is then going to hand over that information to the client organisation, and it will need to be there for the third new role, because the principal designer is one statutory role, the principal contractor is a second. There will also be a building safety manager who will have to demonstrate competence, and all that's got to be developed and written pretty much from scratch. But the building safety manager need to get hold of the golden thread in order to manage the building. And when we stop and think about it, most blocks of flats are there for 60, 70, 80, 90 years. Look at some of the old London County Council stock that is over 100 years old. Did it take 4 or 5 years to build? The service life of those buildings is many, many times the length of the construction period. And we've got to get ourselves into thinking about the whole life of the structure and not just the construction project life of the structure. So very much golden thread starts with the principal designer, it's handed over to the building safety manager, and for the things being built now, it should still be around long after any of us are still around.
Okay, thank you very much. Got a couple more. So we got a, bearing in mind this is a long overdue and radical change, how long do you think the government will allow to transition, and are the timescales realistic?
Gosh, where do we start on that one? Well, I think government is trying to make this manageable. So, some people say, well, the initial emphasis on buildings over 18 metres and 6 stories, many more buildings should be in. And the answer that's been given on more than one occasion is that this has got to be a manageable project. And if we take buildings over 18 metres, 6 stories, we're looking at 11 to 12,000 in the residential sector. And that looks to be about a manageable quantity. And it looks about realistic to get them set up with safety cases over a period of 3 to 5 years after the legislation goes through. Again, there is nothing on earth that stops, and it isn't stopping, the early adopters in the housing sector are already starting to put this stuff in place. They're already working on it. They are not being constrained by thinking, oh, we can't do anything about this until the building safety bill is passed. Nonsense. They're starting now. So, some of this can be done in reasonable timescales. The reality is that some of this, I think my questioner and I will both be long retired before this has worked its way right through the system. And there's probably a rump who will never get changed, unfortunately. And this is probably going to take a decade or two to work through fully. but we have to make a start, and government is choosing to start where the risks are greatest. And, I think, yeah, it will be tough, and there will be times when things don't go to plan. But my plea is that we all put our shoulders to the wheel rather than trying to identify the ways that we think the wheel is going to come off.
Okay. Thank you very much. There's a few more. There's some comments here, some questions. I'll just go to the questions first, and some of the comments, maybe if we get time, we'll come back to them. And if I don't get to any questions, hopefully, how it's okay, we can pass them on afterwards, and we can try and answer them.
By all.
Yeah, okay. So there's a question here. Actually, there's another good one from Sean. So, has the move away from having a traditional clerk of works contributed to poor quality on site, including work not meeting design specifications, i.e. the lack of appropriate fire breaks and seals, perhaps?
I think I'm going to have to give a personal opinion here, because I'm not sure that there's really robust data, although certainly the Institute of Clerks of Works would say, yeah, absolutely. I'm sure that having people on a site whose job is to go around checking must have a beneficial impact. Again, I think one of the challenges of changing the culture is you don't only have to build stuff properly because there's a bloke watching, and it will usually be a bloke watching over your shoulder to make sure you do it. There are other industrial sectors where people produce reasonable quality without having to have somebody standing over their shoulder. I mean, in one sense, and I may be controversial here, if we go back to the 1970s, the then British car industry largely went to the wall because it had a similar approach to construction quality to chunks of the current construction industry. And the Japanese came in and cleaned up on the back of that. Well, the construction industry's got to take a bit more responsibility, I think, for its output. And I don't want to deny that clerks of works could have a hand in that. But some companies may look at it and say, well, we don't need to bring in a clerk of works. What we do need to do is all pull our socks up and make sure that we're trying to deliver quality output.
Yeah, it's a tough one, isn't it? And there's a couple of questions there from Paul as well about the same sort of thing. This, and I appreciate what you're saying about this people just doing a good job when somebody's watching. Not necessarily, some people obviously don't do that. Most people don't do that, but occasionally there are some that do. So another question here: who is likely to provide the training for the new inspector's role? And which industry backgrounds do you think would be suitable for the new roles?
Right. Well, I think there are two distinct elements to this. Clearly, the building safety regulator is going to need to employ building control professionals. And I know there are conversations going on within the building control community about that. I hope that the regulator will go and talk to senior and more experienced people who remember what it was like getting into the Faculty of Building Control 20 years ago, when people had real exams and had to do case study projects to demonstrate that they knew how to do this stuff. I wonder whether some of that rigor needs to be dusted down and reintroduced. And the building safety regulator will need building control people to go out and do jobs for it. They will also need a body of people who won't necessarily be building control professionals, but will be experienced in running a regulatory body and in supporting enforcement activity, and also in working with the industry. The building safety regulator, one of its statutory duties is to work with the industry to raise levels of competence and professional standards. It's not all about, the regulators won't all be walking around with big sticks. Some of them will be walking around with big carrots, and we need to work out how we're going to engage with that. And there's a role there for the professional bodies to do that, to get alongside the regulator and identify how we can work with them to raise standards. Okay,
that's really good. Conscious of time, and I want to wrap up soon, and someone's coming just the last minute. One last question, and you're not going to cover this in a couple of minutes, so it's interested to hear on your thoughts on what the relative impact could be on build costs and programme with the proposed changes, which everybody's in agreement needs to happen, but obviously it's going to be difficult managing the extra costs and the extra time on programme that this might have an impact on clients or developers, that obviously time is money for them. So while it's accepted by everybody that needs to happen, and it'll be happening to everybody the same across all across all parts of the construction, so all contractors would have to deal with it, all consultants and all clients and all developers would have to deal with the same regulations. So really the impact should be the same on all of them, but how is it going to be received from the client side?
Well, of course, the biggest client is the public sector. So, if the public, and again, there's a real challenge for the public sector. If we don't change the way we procure, it will be very difficult to make some of this stuff stick. If we have clients who still want cheapest or lowest cost at almost any price, then some of this stuff will be difficult to deliver. And so the public sector has got a leading role to play, and I believe that work is being done on that. In the affordable housing sector, where there may be a concern that this is going to increase costs and make it more difficult to provide, I think some of the housing association providers, yes, they can see some initial costs, but if they're actually provided with a golden thread and an asset with information, with all the information they need to manage it, there may be some very substantial operational savings to come from knowing what it is they're managing and therefore being able to predict what it will cost to manage. So yes, there will be some cost implications. I'm absolutely certain that the social housing sector are looking at this, and my understanding is that government understands that there will be costs and that they will need to be addressed. Whenever government brings in legislation that introduces new cost burdens on public bodies, that is one of the things that they have to work out. Not only what are those costs, but how are those costs going to be met from the public purse, and I'm sure that there are some civil servants diligently beavering away on that one already. Yeah. And there was a follow-up to that actually, and the author of that question did clarify that it was actually focused around affordable housing. So I'm glad you put on that. But I spotted it in the chat and changed course. So okay, well, we've reached 4 o'clock, so we've still got 80 odd people on the call, and there's one more question that's coming. If you've still got a couple more minutes, Hal. I'm happy to stay on, and I appreciate that others may have to drop out to go to another Teams meeting. The numbers will diminish shortly. So if this is approached in the right manner, any increase in capital costs will pale into significance in the overall life of the cycle of the building, which is the comment that we're all agreeing on, I think, actually. So I thought that was another question. I think I've covered all the questions that we've had there, actually. So, yeah, some nice compliments in the chat menu as well, saying it's been interesting and a well worthwhile online event. So that's nice to hear as well. So we've got people dropping off now. It's reached 4 o'clock. So unless there's anything else, Hal or Fiona or Julian, that we need to add, we'll sign off.
No, James, nothing to add here. Just say thank you very much for organising, and Hal very much for presenting. It's greatly appreciated.
No problem.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you very much. Take care. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Take care. See you. Bye.